Yeah, thank you as well for the invitation. Like in a soccer match, I'm a player which was substituting another player whom I do not really know, so I don't know what the expectations will be towards my knowledge. I will speak about the Red Vienna of the interwar period based on a project that I did very, very long time ago. But this project was re-excavated by others and by myself several times. So actually, as you can see, this is really old. 1995, I came to Vienna after I had studied in Graz and then did some traveling years around Europe. And when I settled down in Vienna, I needed a job, so I was looking around where there might be some interesting options. It had been at the Technical University Institute for Housing, at a Czech professor called Jan Tunovsky, who was very enthusiastic of hiring all sort of weirdos which are working in between all the disciplines. And so I got the option to teach housing, a seminar or a studio, how they would call it nowadays. And I misused my own obsession for getting the students to do research for me. I knew that some of the artists of older generation in Vienna had beautiful studios of enormous size in social housing blocks of the Red Vienna, in former wash houses, laundry salons, etc. So originally I wanted to have something like that myself. And I made a 2-semester design studio where I sent them all over the city to look for voids, or let's say misused spaces within the housing blocks. And at the end of the 2-year seminar, I made an exhibition, which was a traveling exhibition, traveling from one block to the next, being hosted by some of these vacant institutions. Some of them turned out not to be vacant at all. And the students were forced to sit there for 1 week. They were also paid to sit there for 1 week and to defend what they designed for that spaces, while I was creating a sort of show about the history of the Red Vienna and its, let's say, legacy to counter or to juxtapose the visionary designs of the students. And that was then also juxtaposed by the local people, which didn't want anybody to listen to the students only, but also to listen to their story about the housing block, while some art historians or architecture historians from the Architecture Center Vienna did their stories about the issue. So it was intentionally a collision of several interpretations of what these housing blocks might have been or what they might have been in 1995. Interestingly, this exhibition was then excavated by the Vienna Vienna Museum of History for an exhibition called Wiener Linien of artists working by walking around the city. And recently it was excavated by the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York, but not by the Austrian Cultural Forum, but by Mr. Förster, who made an exhibition about the success of Viennese housing that was shown in New York and that turned out to be an enormous success. There was so much positive feedback that now our mayor, how it's called, councillor for housing, reintroduced that the city of Vienna will do social housing themselves again. So the Red Vienna is back, at least for this election campaign. And the elections are in autumn. So I suppose that most of you know some basic knowledge, but as you can never be sure. So what was the housing program and what was it based on? Actually, after the First World War, Vienna, or let's say Austria, became shrunk down to the schnitzel you know nowadays. It was a rather large empire, as you know. And in the very first elections after First World War, the first free elections, that meant that people of all social classes, men and women, were allowed to vote, which is not yet normal in many countries. Austria started in 1919, others, Switzerland, changed quite recently only. The Social Democratic Party gained absolute majority and kept majority or kept to be in power almost all the time, despite of these few periods of either, like we would call it in social democratic language, Austro-fascist dictatorship of 34 to 38, or fascist, German fascist dictatorship from 1938 to the end of Second World War. One of the major issues was, of course, that a lot of male people came back home from war, either wounded, either handicapped, at least highly frustrated, and with enormous, let's say, potential for aggression. So there was a fear of uprising, and one of the, of course, devices to calm down the fear was the housing program. Interestingly, at that period of time, communists were accusing the Social Democrats that they missed the opportunity for revolution. Because in that specific situation, with that anger and aggression, it would have been easy, to take over power entirely and not waiting and postpone it to eternity like it happened successfully. And as you all know, the Viennese are the most lazy people when it comes to political demonstrations and aggressive actions against foreigners. There's an urban myth that you always need to have Germans to come to Vienna to make a real riot. And one of the things I will not talk about is the Vienna settlement movement, that many of these people returning home from war just started to build their own houses, homes, cutting down woods illegally, not woods, but trees illegally. And typically for the Viennese Social Democratic Party, they didn't really like that. So they invented a sort of legal system to domesticize and legalize the wild settlements and to make them the Viennese Social Democratic Settlement Movement, where several famous architects joined and gave their advice in developing, let's say, sort of improved, partly rationalized housing at the margins of the city following some garden city ideas. This is a whole bunch of research that several people did and do, but not myself. I got into the opposite direction, or I got interested in the opposite, let's say, physical appearance of the Vienna housing program, which was what was later coined the Superblock, the large-scale housing projects built as close to the center of the city and dispersed all over the city to integrate what the Social Democrats imagined to be the new man, the new social democratic man within the entire cityscape of Vienna. And in their own language, and also in the, there was the notion coined of the Volkswohnungspalast, the people's apartment palace, consciously referring to the palace of the empire, which had just been declined and kicked out of the country. This is obviously visible in many of the housing blocks' visual design strategies, and of course caused a lot of criticism from the field of architecture at the period of time and later on. The Viennese housing program went for significant improvement of the housing question, but it went for the absolutely wrong visual language. So we do a semi-revolution reform without reforming the style, but taking over the style that existed before or adapting it only slightly. But something about the preconditions. The war, so our Viennese housing program is absolutely unimaginable without First World War. In First World War, the emperor's administration made the most important juridical decisions. One was that, of course, at the end of the war, nobody wanted to volunteer to join the army for the war. Probably even at the beginning, not too many of those who would be killed anyway wanted to join. So they had the smart idea that whoever joins the army gets the guarantee that his family cannot be kicked out of the apartment while he is serving for the emperor. And that the rent stays controlled during the period of time. Afterwards, we will have won the war anyway, and we needn't bother about any problems. And luckily, we lost the war, and almost every city that I know did not dare to change that law. So they kept what we would nowadays call rent cap, and the sort of guarantee to stay in these apartments. Also, the apartments of the Red Vienna were not yet built. And the Red Vienna was very smart by implementing, these laws, of course, somehow had an effect on the private real estate market. It became more difficult and less interesting to invest and sell. And the other thing which they did, and which also has a sort of funny revival nowadays, here this poster, which looks horrible from the, so let's say, design, because from a Jewish cultural background, one would argue that this is obviously an anti-Semite drawing of the evil Jewish capitalist, but interestingly, it became a sort of super international transformation. Anyway, it's claiming that we have to save the rent gap and the protection of the rent of the tenants not to be kicked out by the evil capitalists. And the second thing, which is I wanted to put my focus, is that the city administration implemented a quite harsh radical tax on everything which they consider to be luxurious goods. This is in the recent campaigns of Social Democratic Party in Austria and Vienna. This is coming up again, that we want to have the Reichensteuer, so the rich people have to be radically taxed because they have to contribute more to the benefit of the social reforms or to prevent our bankruptcy. And it's nice because in the tradition of Red Vienna, everything is named, so Mr. Breitner himself, so it's like it's his personal tax invention. So it's my Breitner, I'm the councillor, so it's my tax, and please vote for me that I can guarantee that the rich people get exploited and we can finance this housing program. So it's about work, bread, and peace, and the housing program. Of course, this is a poster of the very end of the social democratic period of the interwar times, because it shows Karl Marxhof, which was built as the last one of the whole development. And this is an earlier poster in the very bad resolution, describing the idea of dispersing all the big housing blocks all over Vienna, and by dispersing the housing blocks, also dispersing the educational, hygienic, pedagogical ideas and amenities that come with the housing blocks. So each housing block consisted not only about apartments, which should be available, but also about washing saloons, laundry saloons, in many cases, workers' libraries, and social democratic party rooms. And it was a conscious policy, which was later praised by some other communist thinkers in the 60s, to put them everywhere where there's a piece of land available. The Social Democrats did not only purchase the land on their own territory. Much of the land was, how you call it, communalized before. In many cases, it was ground by the church, which was expropriated from church ownership, because the idea then was to make a central funeral. The central funeral existed, but to invent fire funerals and to get the land of the church in places close to the city free for social housing blocks. So it was not only a friendly policy, but interestingly, for quite a long time, there was no escalation of conflicts about the housing policy. There are rumors that some conservatives might have thought it's a good idea of the Social Democrats to keep them all calm and do the things that we can't do ourselves. That at least was the accusation from communist time. While the majority of avant-garde modernist architects would have wanted to go for the Garden City movement or for the settlement movement, the city administration planners insisted on the big blocks built within the city. This is again atypical because it's Karl Marxhof, but it's easy to explain the main principles of organization and of self-control. So the basic idea is that there are big inside yards. First, the basic idea is, which I wanted to draw on the whiteboard, is that as you can read in their own publications, the evil capitalist housing development of the 19th century was basically taking a piece of land and building on every meter of the land, despite of the few meters where you're not allowed by law. So in the evil capitalist developments, there is 80% of built ground and only 20% of, let's say, ventilation, because there is no chance for the sun to get into these little chimneys. And the idea of the Social Democrats was to turn the proportion around, so upside down, that it's 20% of the ground will be built on and 80% should remain as open garden. Also, as we have learned later, the open garden was not necessarily to be put your feet on, because control was obsessive. But anyway, so this is one of the last projects with the largest amount of garden. And the idea was that all the inhabitants or the tenants of these yards have a little staircase with a limited number of apartments, which is absolutely the same as sort of security design in American British context of the 80s, for example. Then they gather in the inside yard, not on the terrible, dangerous street. So it was of major importance that the staircases don't have doors to the street, because then the anyhow endangered working class hero man would be directly on the street and opposite of the alcohol consuming or offering bars, and the little kids would also be directly on the street and get seduced by the, the dangerous atmosphere and the uncontrollable urban atmosphere and myths of the street, which was somehow a sort of really scary item for the social democratic main ideologies, which had, of course, been no workers, but bourgeois intellectuals, which went for these political directions. So you could imagine that all the kids in the morning leave the apartments and run into the big inside yard. And in the big inside yard, as you can see here as well, in the very center are the institutions of the city of Vienna, which is the kindergarten, to catch them, or at least to supervise them if they're not yet caught by the kindergarten automatically. And in Karl Marxov, it's quite funny because it's so extremely, let's say, obvious. The small building is the kindergarten, and the big building is the central wash house. This is the place where you wash your laundry and where you wash yourself. In later calculations, it turned out that the capacity of these washing houses was not very much matching the number of people there. But from my own experience, it was more than enough, because my own super bourgeois grandma washed herself only once a week on Saturday. So the need for these hygienic measurements were not even high in super bourgeois, families. But she had, of course, the bathroom in her own apartment. And what is interesting to mention is that, especially in Karl Marxov, as one of the last examples, but it happened before, the kindergarten and the wash house, so let's say the building symbolizing progress of education and of hygienic lifestyle, had been more or less designed like chapels. That is the central representative yard. That is in Karl Marxov, since it's so large, there are several entrance gates into the inside yard, and one of the most prominent, you can already see the central wash house inside, and then you see the kindergarten in the very center, which is somehow theoretically or symbolically attracting all the kids of the working class families to get educated in the new way to become the future new social democratic men, women, and children. Interestingly, these housing blocks were built consciously in a low-tech style. So no matter what was already developed on construction building market, they were built in bricks with very simple beam constructions, so that as many unskilled workers could contribute to the construction of the buildings. The building material came from communalized building plants, construction material plants. It was built by city-owned construction companies, was transported by city-owned transport company, partly by public transport of the city, which was built before building the houses, to transport the goods and the building material, and then transporting the people. So basically, the costs for construction were extremely cheap, and the participation of people via the jobs had been rather large. In the very, very first social democratic housing block, Fuchsenfeldhof in 12th district, there had been in the basement of the yard inside some self-organized workshops for workers to teach themselves skills, and some club rooms for clubs which were not the Social Democratic Party, for self-management or self-organization. In the second development, these self-managed, self-organized clubs disappeared already and were substituted by the clubs that the city implemented itself. And there had been no further self-organized workshops existing in the future of Superblocks, because there was this ongoing mistrust of the social democratic intellectuals towards their own clientele, which might gather without the experts of the city or without the experts of the Democratic Party, and then develop probably a sort of social democratic new man, which is not exactly matching with the idea of the party ideologists. For the point of view of architecture history, of course, Karl Marxov represents the Otto Wagner school of rational urban design, while interestingly, the more ambitious architects and those who started the Red Vienna superblock housing design had been hybridly following, I would say, Camillo Sitti's idea of the organic city. Here you can see the 5th district compound of a high density of superblocks. Reumenhof is the rectangular one, and all the others were built by the same team of architects, but as part of the same development project in a completely different style with rather, let's say, semi-organic urban structures, and also with a much more diverse variety how to place and brand the new amenities of social design of the Red Vienna. Here the Waschhaus is no more a chapel or a cathedral of hygienic progress. It's embedded in one of the buildings. The kindergarten is more integrated, but nevertheless in Reumenhof the kindergarten is in the very center. And the topology looks rather romantic, and here you can see the entrance to this, let's say, urban environment with this reddish basement with, of course, Coop Konsum store and a pharmacy to again symbolize our self-organization. It means the self-organization of the city of Vienna to supply you with food and medicine and health. And the interesting places, the interesting windows on top of the towers signalize some different use, and that are artist studios, which are having no elevator, so it's not so easy for nowadays artists. And this one is the exit tower of the same compound. And this is the most beautiful artist studio the city of Vienna ever built. So on top of the development is a painter's studio with 2 floors and gallery, etc. And again, so ideologically speaking, the crown of the city development is the artist studio, which also implements artistic progress into the working class neighborhood. Most of the art historians would argue that the art that was produced at that period of time was really rather backwarded and super conservative, almost horrible from a modernist point of view. But again, it was interesting. It was a conscious decision not to go for the avant-garde artists of the country, but to go for those who make the most cozy sculptures. And in many of the housing blocks, you see at some specific strategic places some weird, for example, it will come anyway, sculptures which look like Baroque babies, which indicate this is the road to kindergarten. So they were really used as a sort of public, what do we call it? Navigation system for the people that they see when there is this baby sculpture. You just have to bring your kids there if you really want to bring them there, and you will find service by the professionals. Here you can see one of these examples, very small on the photograph. It's here. It's a mother bear with a baby bear on top, facing outside of the city, where you can see it from the Stadtbahn. So everybody who passes by with train could already see the mother bear and the baby bear. And that's indicating that there must be something dealing with children nearby, which is this little children water bassin. But more importantly, at the corner of this housing block is what they called Mutterberatungsstelle, which I don't know how to translate, but maybe it's something like a mother care service station. It's an institution that tries to teach mothers of the new class how to teach the children in the style they want them to teach them. And interestingly, it turned out that the people didn't really voluntarily go there, so the city of Vienna invented some gifts to seduce people to come to the service that was also advertised with cinema commercials, that you got what nowadays called Koffer, Babykoffer, Sexkoffer, Aufklärungskoffer, Drogenkoffer, so a little suitcase, actually a package, with all the things you need as a young mother. And you had to subscribe there, go there, line up, and then they caught you. And they would bring the package to your apartment and can open the door and see if you really, have an organized household and teach your children well. Unluckily, all these pools for children are gone in the meantime, because beginning with the, I think, late 70s, 80s, people started, the very same people who grew up children there started to complain about the noise of the children of those who came after them. One of the most beautiful of these pools in Fuchsenfeldhof, the very first pool, which had also the biggest animals. They're called hippos, like our bank from Austria, which is now bankrupt. But of course, they're indicating that this is a place for children to play. And these animals sadly disappeared. So as an artist, of course, I desperately wanted to look for them and find them again and bring them back to the art, but it turned out that it's impossible. So of course, if you would be a little bit mean to the social democratic politicians, you could imagine, and somebody would have them in his private dacha, 2 hippos at his little biotop. But since I'm a typical Austrian opportunist, I would never ever criticize Social Democratic Party publicly. And here you can see the causes for the noise, and so therefore this park is gone. Here you can see the kindergarten in use of the period of time. All these photographs were done by the very same photographer, Berlach, who just had the job to document it all, and are very well preserved nowadays. I had the chance then for the exhibition that I went to the City Archive of the City of Vienna and asked for permission to reproduce them, which I was not given. But after 3 days of suffering and just giving evidence that I'm interested, the boss of the archive told me that 2 days later he promises me that he will be away for the whole day. So I came back 2 days later with the repro camera and reproduced whatever I could reproduce. And when I wanted to ask them what should I write down as a source, they said, you can't write down Archive of the City of Vienna because you have never been here. Write down Museum of the City of Vienna because they have some photographs as well and they won't give evidence. That is one of the most beautiful parts. It's just behind the hippos and behind the swimming pool. One of these self-organized workers' clubs, which can be used as a cinema, as a theater, as a meeting room. In 1934, after the short civil war, when the Austro-fascists had beaten the Social Democrats and installed the dictatorship, it was used as a chapel for the Catholic Church. Because, of course, the Social Democrats did not build chapels into their housing compounds. So the Austro-fascists afterwards substituted chapels wherever it was possible. So it became a chapel. And in 1938, when the German fascists, which were not German fascists, because when the Austrian fascists, the non-Catholic fascists, took over power, they transferred the Catholic chapel into a Hitlerjugend, party room. And after the Second World War, when the Social Democrats got power again, it was retransferred into a Sozialistische Jugend club, Socialist Youth Club room, but then handed over to a variety of strange clubs like South Tyrolean dance companies, and changed ownership several times until most recently it became a social housing project for handicapped elderly people with medical service implemented. That is the big theater and concert and cinema hall at St. Leiten social housing block, which was really a super professional cinema. And again, after it was transferred in use several times, and when I was going there as first time in my life, it was a Konsummarkt on the first floor in this big thing with a ceiling hanging from top so that you couldn't feel the size of the space anymore. And then Konsum, our social democratic, store, got bankrupt itself, finally. but the space is still there, but again, used for different purposes. And this is the big washing saloon of Matjottihof, which is not built as a chapel, like in Karl-Marxhof, but as a sort of compound that connects two parts of the housing block. In here is the washing facility, which is as large as a 60s, 70s Olympic swimming pool. And on top of it are the places to wash yourself, women to the right, men to the left side. Then with the small windows, it's the place for ironing your clothes. And on top, as you can see, is a fence, because this is considered to be a roof terrace for the people to sleep outside, especially the kids, but also adults, to protect tuberculosis, which was considered to be the main issue at that period of time. The dangerous opposition of the new clean laundry machines had been this situation of a mother taking care of her children while she's doing her laundry. And that had been the propaganda photos of the opposite. That's now in Karl-Marxhof. There is a steam power station in the washing house, as if it would be a hospital nowadays. You know, the factory of hygienic progress is working constantly as long as there is enough gas or oil. That is how they looked at the beginning, that they were open, so people could watch each other washing the laundry. You put in your stuff during night in these bazaars, and then later you cooked them in some of the ovens at the backside. But this is, gas-driven. These are gas-driven ironing machines. This is the, let's say, industrialized version of the same stuff now in the basement of one of the housing blocks. So at the right-hand side, you have these separation walls that nobody watches, can see your laundry directly. And here you have these big sort of ovens. And that is then the final thing what happened, that in the next step, they separated these parts so that everybody has its private, let's say, garderobe thing where he can wash his stuff during the night, and next day he puts them into these ovens. And interestingly, from the gender aspect, was that men and children were not allowed to enter these spaces, but the spaces were usually run by a male operator. So the machinist was male, who was running the machines, who was teaching the women how to use the devices. So some of these places have outside to the front some sort of cage, I would call it now like cages, like in a zoo, where you can put your children while you do your laundry. And of course, it immediately started some sort of black market of people who were not working and doing the laundry for all the others. And later on, when the machinists were no more necessary, the housemeisters in charge of these spaces became even more powerful people as the normal housemeisters in the Red Vienna. When I was doing my project, this space, looked exactly like that. It was used as a storage for school furniture. And we just could use the front space for our traveling exhibition with a slideshow of all these compounds of the neighborhood and slideshows of the others. And I had this DJ equipment because the students wanted to make opening parties. So we had 5 opening parties because we have 5 openings. The opening parties were so loud that everybody in the neighborhood knew that there's something is going on. So people came. Actually, people didn't come always. Children came and adopted the spaces which were normally closed for them for their own use. And this was a poor student because several parents just brought the children there because they thought the city of Vienna had opened a new childcare center for free. And actually it was used by the Social Democratic Fencing Club since 30 years already. Had a superb rustic pub-in, bar built in, beautiful gymnastic rooms. That's in Karl-Marxhof, different variation of the same. There, the student claimed that the room is not used at all, which turned out to be wrong. It was only not used when she was there, because she was always there when there was nobody. But then we had to arrange a deal with the local ping pong club, which were playing professionally in the league, to make both the exhibition and ping pong tournaments with the students. And this was in a Social Democratic Party club in St. Leiten, which was probably the most mean selection, because we argued that the people are dying away, so they really have a radical decrease of membership. And there had been only 4 ladies left, which were really in charge for the place, and which were very happy that we came. And then there was the party secretary who wanted to do the introduction speech, and while he was doing the speech, they obviously misbehaved in front of him because they were arguing that he is not telling the truth about this neighborhood. The truth is only known by them because they live there since all their life. And that are fancy students, doing the service. In this washing house, which still is intact, we had this exhibition and opening, and interestingly, the opening and the party lasted until 2 o'clock in the morning. People didn't intermingle with us, but they just used the chance to wash the laundry until 2 o'clock in the morning. Nowadays, they have a more liberal system of using the laundry saloons. And here is my favorite student, as you can see. He dressed up like a politician or like an investor and tried to convince all the visitors about the genius idea he proposed. And here you can see the powerful ladies of the wash house, which also partly dressed up very beautifully for the official event, but which told everybody that the idea of the students is absolutely bullshit because they need this space, because that's their meeting space. And at the end of the project, I thought I will make some sort of deviant artist intervention, and there was the opportunity to make a one-page ad in the daily newspaper Standard. And this is the English translation. Of course, I didn't make it in English, but I used the most beautiful photograph I had for a one-page ad, and I pretended that I am a real estate company which offers the great opportunity to rent this space from myself. And originally, I had put the telephone number of the person who really is in charge in the city of Vienna here, which I'm now forbidden by law. So I have to use my own now in the reproductions. But anyway, the idea was, of course, that the people who see this ad would call it the city of Vienna and ask them, how do we get these beautiful spaces for us, for use? But these people are really professionals. So this guy never called me personally. He just gave all these people my private telephone number and redirected the request to me and all the complications, how I explain that this is, I'm sorry, it's not really for sale, it's not really on rent. But it was quite interesting effect, and I think 2 or 3 years later, the Department for Culture in the city of Vienna asked me if I can hand them over my research, because they are looking desperately for studio spaces for artists and for art venues, because they don't know anything about it, because every of these spaces was under control by different department of the city of Vienna, and therefore almost hopeless to get access to, even for high-rank people from the city government and administration itself. In the 20s and the 30s, all over Europe, we had this art in public space or Kunst am Bau funds, which were partly coming from the demands of the artists' unions, that they were claiming for, getting finally paid for something. And on the other hand side, it of course came from the regimes themselves, that they wanted to have a specific art illustrating their political task. And interestingly, in the Red Vienna housing program, you would not find any, let's say, Stalinist artworks, but you also don't find really advanced modernist artworks. It's somehow very strangely in between. It's, if I would be rather mean, I would argue it's like children's book illustrations, telling those people, which the elitist, ideologists of the party thought are not yet capable of understanding avant-garde art, but which is needed to illustrate our progress. So it was, there's one housing block where they made beautiful frescoes on the ceiling, which look like frescoes from a church, but they show the professions, And especially when they're kindergartens, you always see these Baroque angels with puppets done by in one of the yards, done by the sculptor which had his studio there. This guy really made his whole career, Greci, for example, only with the social democratic housing program. He was not accepted anywhere else as an artist of value. But anyway, I would argue again from this, it was quite convincing part of the same corporate language strategy of copying aristocratic, prestigious architecture with these sort of cozy sculptures to make a sort of comic style illustration of we had won the revolution. And that is interestingly the aspect that was also then later discussed in the 60s by the avant-garde Marxist architects and theoreticians. Manfredo Furi was arguing that this is hopeless, absolute bullshit, this idea. No way. Okay, it was successful. on a social level, but on an aesthetic level, it is a disaster. Well, as you know, Aldo Rossi was much in favor for these developments because for him it was a support for his idea of these sort of typologies. You know, you need to organize, let's say, the aesthetic language of the city. And the most interesting, let's say, praising comment is from Tronti, which is a post-operaist activist and theoretician, which has nothing to do with architecture normally, who would be expected to be in favor of Superstudio, for example, with this sort of, very abstract, radical 60s design, which of course is a sort of high school, fancy, leftist, posh idea, which didn't lead to anything at all. But he said, better than Superstudio is Red Vienna, because they took, let's say, they in a sort of postmodern language, which was not his language, but I would argue the Red Vienna, in my interpretation, was he said the Red Vienna hyper-affirmed what bourgeois enemies and aristocrats did before, reproduced it, and put it in front of the nose of the enemy. So there was no chance to escape that the Social Democrats had taken over power. Building some garden cities at the margin of the city wouldn't have bothered anybody. 15 years later, they're all unemployed anyway, and we take over our city again. In that case, they took over the city anyway by civil war. And of course, there are several works about the art, the role of the art in the Red Vienna housing program by art historians, because it's so strange if, as a normal art historian studying in Vienna, you of course think that the Red Vienna must have been a very progressive, power, and you think that there must be some of Otto Neurath's brilliant thinking in the art as well. But as we know that Otto Neurath, when he started to make his diagrams, he asked his wife, who was doing children's book, to make the drawings. So it has a sort of same consciously, naively chosen language to start with before he got in contact with the German professional graphic designer.
Was there any genuine cooperation between artists and architects? Well, it seems to me that you put it, that the artists were just commissioned to design a piece in a particular new iconography. Yeah? But was there any genuine cooperation?
Painful question, good question. The artists were organized in the artists.
The 1930s are a very specific period because in, let's say, in this country, art disappears from architecture.
Yeah, but that's why the artists had been so happy, that they were not forced to be integrated into the language of the architecture. So Bauhaus was probably, for the majority of artists all over the world, a horrible development because they lost the war against Gropius and his powerful position, So in Vienna they were happy, We can make whatever we want, and Mr. Loos is not allowed to say anything, because he's busy with his garden city and settlement movement, And I think that is, of course, these housing projects and the art projects were not integrated in the discourses of the 30s of modern elitist avant-garde because they were so strange and ununderstandable for everybody. They were also criticized from the Garden City movement, but then the city of Vienna was not stupid. They just invited the International Garden City Conference to Vienna and showed them around what they had, and also declared the lately built big compounds as to be our interpretations of Garden City. So it was a really very strange, let's say, super self-conscious design decision from the political elites, which was, of course, very much hated by the architects, but all the architects joined. Architects, opportunists as they are, almost always. You will find not only social democratic architects which built there, probably they're the minority, because they had joined the other power structure before and afterwards. And many of them had been even super bourgeois, of course, by choice of studying that. And many of them had been rather conservative from style. But the city administration had no problem with style. They would have gone for Peter Behrens built one housing block as well, which is a bit more modern. But even Peter Behrens had to give in and accept a sculpture which is implemented by the city administration at the very best corner.
It seems to me that maybe it's a question for you, that maybe not that easy to answer, but does it mean that can architecture express political content without art? Or, or is art always in service?
I studied architecture myself, and I was taught, and I believed that I don't need any art because I'm the artist myself. So I will do that all from my own perspective. And I think it's interesting because I'm also working as an artist, and I'm working in some of commissions where artists and architects should collaborate now. And the synthesis of art and architecture that was so glamorous, typical for specific periods in history in different countries, didn't really exist in Austria in that way. If so, then the architects got crazy and became artists themselves. But when they stepped back to architecture, they became architects again, despite of a few examples. And I know that many artists which hate the architects, including myself, if I ask to do a work in public space and have an architect as my enemy, then he's really my enemy because he wants to dominate the spatial perception. And then it's a sort of clash of what both of us would like to communicate. And I think this was a smart decision. You know, it's a city secretary just says, that's your job, done, left over these places. It was not so from my other research of the socialist holidays at the former Yugoslav, now Croatian part, the largest part Croatian coast. When you talk to the people, it's very funny that some people say that the artist was chosen because he was the friend of the architect. In other ways, they said the artist was chosen because he was the friend of the state secretary who just forced the company to take this artist. But there was, of course, a better, let's say, a longer tradition from the place where they studied that they had learned to communicate. I think in this period in Vienna, it was rather a strange gap. But I don't think that it's really a gap. I think it fits very well together.
Minor question. This went on after 1945, this contribution of the arts. I know that there was a percentage of the building sum in all council housing devoted to artistic work. And the father of a friend of mine, he was an artist, he was doing sculptures for all, but some when it ended. Do we know when it ended? Will there be sculptures in front of the new public housing in Vienna?
I think, so I did not do really serious research about that, but one aspect that came up to my mind is that after this disaster of '34, when Social Democrats and conservatives battled each other and therefore gave up everything for the real fascists, there was this strange reconciliation policy after the Second World War again, which also had its effect on the art. It was more or less feeding all sort of artists by the program than having a program about what art is about. And I think that from the very point when the city of Vienna stopped building the housing programs themselves, the logistic argument was gone because then it was no more officially a public housing project where you take 1% for the art decoration. Decoration is always a bit mean because it was to be meant more. And when it was handed over to the non-profit associations, they were free of that, let's say, duty. And interestingly, it came then back in other fields, for example, U-Bahn Vienna, public transport stations. And again, this art, which you can see in our public transport stations, is not really very up to date. You know, it's again a sort of very, let's say, paternalistic idea of supporting one of my best friends if I'm in the correct old boys networks, and you get several hundred meters for doing something. Interestingly, recently in Vienna, well, recently maybe it was only 10 years before the city of, if not less, the city of Vienna refounded an art and public space program that has a budget and that has a professional jury, and that is not, and the artworks are not fixed to the buildings but can be made wherever it's possible. But that program was more or less driven not by the city of Vienna but by the province of Lower Austria, which is around Vienna, which had established a very progressive art and public space program, and so the city of Vienna had to do something about it. Now, for example, the city of Vienna is planning a museum of history because the province of Lower Austria had already made one about contemporary history of post-Second World War, Erlauf.
Okay, last question. Anyone have a last question? Yeah, I mean, I have myself several questions, but maybe it can wait later. Are you staying, Michal, or are you leaving soon?
No, I'm staying. I just want to say, if some people are interested, there's a very nice oral history archive by Reinhard Sieder at the Institute for History of Economy, done with the tenants of the Gemeindebauten during the early 1980s, so tape recorder interviews, including the tenants of the Ein-Küchenhaus, for example. And for me personally, this was the best source to get at least some glimpse about what the original tenants really thought about the developments. Because what I was not talking about, and what is basically their work, which was never published because they didn't get funding by the city of Vienna, is that how the subjects that should be redesigned, or re-engineered, reacted on the plans of the intellectual elites.
I mean, and what was the main excuse of architects to going with this retrogressive style, in comparison to some progressive ideas? I mean, just in comparison to Stalinist, architecture here, it was this basic argument to do architecture that is understandable to ordinary people in comparison to alienated architecture of modern.
I would argue the architects needn't argue at all because it was argued by the city administration already. So if I want to go for some neo blah 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 style, it was welcome anyway, so that you needn't argue. The problem was that the modernist architects desperately tried to argue that this is the wrong way, but they didn't succeed. Interestingly, one of the results, long-term results of the Red Vienna, which has many results, it's the ownership of the city and the ownership of the city of real estate in all over Vienna has an important impact on the price level of housing. But interestingly, also the desire for modern architecture, even when modern architecture is gone. When I studied architecture, we became absolute hooligans of late modern architecture because we felt that Austria doesn't have enough. We became first hooligans of early modernist architecture because we felt Austria doesn't have it. So we had to go to Brno or Zagreb, so the closest cities, to get for some world-class modernist architecture, but we almost didn't have anything in Vienna. And after Second World War, we perceived that what was built in Vienna then was not of that quality. And interestingly, nowadays, there was almost no real postmodern movement in Vienna because people of that generation wanted to be modern, desperately modern. So this sort of delay that the Red Vienna caused is still going on. I think we're still several years behind, luckily.
Okay, thanks a lot.